Hello everyone, this is Devin and this is my project. As you can see, the title of the project is Success in Movies, and the topic is fairly clear from the title. But to clarify, my inspiration did not have to do with ways to become a movie star. I wanted to find the safest and most productive ways to invest money into the production of movies. I determined that investing in a safe or productive way is fairly objective, considering that there are three different ways I thought of that can be considered producing a good movie. As you can see here, each image represents a different type of good movie. We have the critically acclaimed, the audience acclaimed, and the moneymakers. Arguably, each is different, and in my research, I found that each was distinguishable through different statistics. When I started this project, I assumed that the only way to represent a good movie was to find which movies made the most money. But I soon realized this isn't exactly the same as making the most profit. I soon realized that the approach I wanted to use when taking the investor's approach was using return on investment. And as you can see, here's the formula for return on investment. I used the statistics of movies and their return on investment as a way to find which movie earned the most amount per dollar invested. This is probably what investors care most about, considering that every dollar they put in, they're expecting a certain amount back. So here's most of the data I could find on movies that made the highest return on investment. And when I found this list, I was fairly surprised to see the type of movies that made the list. Just quickly looking at the list, you can see some pretty apparent things. For one, the average budget for production for these films is about $5.5 million, meaning most of these films are fairly low budget. These low budgets make the return on investment look enormous. I found this a fairly simple concept, but obviously one that is obviously a hard thing to predict. Invest in cheap movies that will do well in the box office. But there is one large trend that I found that I couldn't help but notice. About 50% of the movies that showed up came up as horror or thriller movies in their genre. Another thing I wanted to point out to keep from skewing the data is that many of these movies were made in a time where inflation should be adjusted but was not adjusted. So as we see here with Grease and Star Wars, Young Frankenstein, and Jaws, all old movies, and these production budgets were not adjusted for inflation. Looking back again at the top 20 most successful movies by return on investment, we should look back at this column that actually shows us a rating that I looked up independently. It's called the IMDb rating. IMDb is a fairly accurate representation of how good the movie did on a 10-point basis. So here you could see that the average star rating was 6.7, about 6.7. And I found that fairly interesting, considering that these movies made the most money and were obviously enjoyed by many people, but had a fairly low star rating. After seeing a trend in which types of movies were most successful, I decided to graph the genres that appeared. This chart shows the strong, obvious spike in how well terror and horror movies do, with both of them showing up 9 times each. Third best being drama with about 6, showing up 6 times. In comparison, here is the list of biggest losses in movie history. For these numbers, I decided to use dollars instead of return on investment to show the loss, because it doesn't really matter the percentage you invested when you're losing money, because the largest number here is still the biggest loser. When looking at this list, I was fairly surprised that these were the biggest failures, because here you can see lots of these movies were directed, produced, and acted by some big name people from Hollywood. You could see The Lone Ranger, Jupiter Ascending, R.I.P.D., Evan Almighty, Speed Racer, which had really good graphics that they had invested a lot of money in, Poseidon, Green Lantern, all movies that were thought to have been blockbusters that just ended up failing, and failing miserably because they made nowhere near amount of money that they invested into the movie. Down here you could see the average expenses and the average incomes, with an average approximate average around $183 million, with average estimate of about $89 million. So as you can see, lots of money was invested, but there are large losses. As for the IMDb rating for the worst movies, here you can see that their star rating wasn't actually that much worse than the top 20. At 5.9, the movies are rated poorly, but not that poorly. So similar to the movies by genre for successful movies, I did the same thing for failed movies. Here you can see there are a lot of movies that required lots of special effects, so lots of action movies, lots of adventure and fantasy movies. These movies, as I was pointing out in the previous slide, used a lot of money to invest in special effects, maybe also in actors and directors, and that's part of the reason that they cost so much and they lost so much. Finally, I decided to look at movies that are acclaimed more by the audience and critics. So here in the top right corner, you can see 15 random movies from Netflix that were rated between 4 and 5 stars. I used a generator that just generated different movies that fit this category, and I thought it was interesting because here you can see the rating for these movies. The average rating was 7.34. And down here, I found a list of another movies by another random generator. It claimed to be random, but it just continuously gave movies that were pretty average movies, as you can see here. You have some blockbusters, some movies I've never really heard of. And so I found that these movies were relatively above average, with an average IMDb rating of 7.16. And I found that interesting because if you rate it to the Netflix between 4 and 5 stars, it's not far behind. But both of these are actually higher than the top 20 movies based on ROI and the bottom 20 movies based on ROI. This was especially interesting or surprising because movies that weren't exactly blockbusters on average had higher ratings than some of the most profitable movies. So that kind of shows you the difference between wanting to create a successful movie in the eyes of an investor and successful movie in the eyes of a director that wants to create something that'll really please his viewers. So that was my project. I hope you learned as much as I did through my presentation. Thank you.